The bay mare came out of the alder thicket like something shot from a gun, reins whipping loose against her lathered neck, and Delia Leland was still in the saddle when the animal broke into a dead run toward the swollen water. She had only meant to ride the fence line above Coyote Creek to see how badly the spring rains had chewed at the lower pasture. A jackrabbit had burst from beneath a manzanita bush not 10 feet from the mare's forelegs, and that was all it took. The mare, a spirited 3-year-old named Juniper that Delia's father had bought the autumn before he died, had never much cared for surprises. She had bolted downhill through wet grass and wild lupin, and now the roar of the creek was rising ahead of them, ugly and brown and swollen twice its width with 3 days of hard rain funneling down out of the Sierra foothills. Delia hauled on the left rein with both hands and felt only the terrible looseness of a horse that had stopped listening. The crossing at the bend was normally a lazy ford, water no higher than a horse's knee, easy enough that ranch children waded it barefoot in August. In late May of 1854, after a wet spring that had turned every dry wash in Tuolumne County into a river, it was something else entirely. The current threw up whitecaps against the rocks. A cottonwood log, uprooted somewhere upstream, spun past trailing branches like a drowning man's arms. Juniper, whoa now, whoa. Delia's voice cracked on the second word. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had delivered calves in the freezing dark, had once pulled a rattlesnake off a sleeping ranch hand with her bare hands and a hoe, had run her father's kitchen and half his ledgers since she was 16. But she understood horses well enough to know that this one had gone somewhere past reason, and the bank was crumbling, wet clay chunks sliding into the current not 30 yards ahead. That was when she heard the second set of hoofbeats coming hard from the east fence line and a man's voice cutting across the wind. "Pull her head around. Don't fight her straight, turn her." Chester Hadley had been driving new cedar posts into the boundary line between the Leland Range and his own homestead acreage since sunrise, his coat soaked through, his hands blistered from the maul, when he had heard the drumming of a runaway and looked up to see Delia Leland's chestnut-brown hair coming loose from its pins as she flew past on a horse with murder in its eyes. He had not thought about it. He had simply swung up onto his own gray gelding, a steady old campaigner named Samson who had outlasted 2 owners and a hard winter in the diggings, and put his heels to the animal's flanks. Now he came up on her left, close enough that he could see her knuckles white on the reins, close enough to see the flooded crossing ahead and understand, with a cold drop in his stomach, that if the mare hit that current at a dead run, there would be nothing left to save. "Turn her into the hill," he shouted again. "Give her something else to run at. She can't fight a slope and the water both." Delia had never taken orders easily from any man, but she understood horse sense when she heard it, and there was no pride left in her, only the roaring water and the certainty that she did not want to die on a Tuesday in May. She leaned hard right, throwing her weight, and hauled the rein until the mare's neck bent like a drawn bow. Juniper screamed and fought, and then, faced with a rising slope of wet grass instead of a straight run to the water, finally broke stride, stumbling, crow-hopping, slowing. Chester came alongside and reached across the gap between the 2 horses, catching hold of Juniper's cheek strap with one gloved hand, even as his own gelding shied from the closeness. For 3 long strides the 2 horses ran nearly touching, and then the mare's legs tangled in her own panic, and she went down hard on the wet grass, spilling Delia clear of the saddle and rolling twice before Chester threw himself off Samson and was on his knees beside her before the dust, such as it was in all that mud, had settled. "Miss Leland." His hands hovered over her shoulders, afraid to touch and afraid not to. "Miss Leland, can you hear me?" She opened her eyes to gray sky and rain and a man's face above her, weathered and lean, with pale gray eyes and a jaw gone tight with worry, and for one strange moment she thought she was looking at someone out of a dream she could not quite place. Then her ribs reminded her with a sharp complaint that she had just been thrown from a horse, and the moment passed into something more ordinary and more real. "I can hear you," she managed. "I would be obliged if you would stop shouting my name like I have already died." A short, startled laugh broke out of him, more relief than humor. "Yes, ma'am. I will try to shout it more respectfully next time." He helped her sit up slowly, checking with careful, impersonal hands that nothing was broken, the way a man checks a horse for a strain, and she let him, because the alternative was trying to stand on her own and she was not entirely certain her legs would agree to it. Juniper had scrambled up a few yards off and stood trembling, reins trailing, chastened. The creek went on roaring past, indifferent to how close it had come to taking her. "You are Hadley," Delia said, when she trusted her voice again. "The one mending the east line. Chester Hadley, yes, ma'am." He sat back on his heels, giving her room, and she noticed, in the businesslike way a person notices things right after nearly dying, that his hands were rough and scarred, and that he had not once, in helping her, touched her anywhere he ought not to have. "I have got the contract from your ranch to reset the boundary fence through the season. Your foreman hired me back in March." "I know who you are," she said, more sharply than she intended, and then softened it, because he had just very likely saved her life and sharpness seemed an ungrateful thing to offer in return. "I have seen you at a distance. I did not expect to meet you quite this way. Can't say I planned it either." He glanced toward the creek, then back at her, and something in his gray eyes went serious. "Another 20 yards and I could not have turned her in time. You are fortunate that Jackrabbit did not spook her closer to the water." "I do not feel fortunate," Delia admitted, pressing a hand to her side. "I feel as though a mule kicked me, but I suppose I would rather feel that than feel nothing at all, floating somewhere downstream toward Knight's Ferry." He offered his hand, and this time she took it and let him pull her to her feet, and stood a moment longer than necessary with her palm still in his, feeling the calluses there, the strength held carefully in check. Then she remembered herself and drew back, brushing mud from her skirt with more attention than the task required. "I am grateful, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Truly. My father would have wanted to shake your hand for this if he were still living to do it." Something crossed his face at that, quick and gone, a shadow she did not understand yet, and he only nodded and went to catch Juniper's trailing reins, murmuring low words to the still-shaking mare until she quieted enough to be led. "I will walk you both back," he said. "That mare is in no state to be ridden, and you have had a fall that deserves a chair and a cup of something hot, not another mile in the saddle." Delia opened her mouth to say she required no escort, that she had ridden this range since she was 7 years old, that she was perfectly capable of walking a lathered horse back to the barn without a fence-mender holding her elbow like an invalid aunt. But the ground still felt unsteady beneath her, and the rain had begun to fall harder, and something in the quiet competence of the man beside her made refusing feel less like independence and more like foolish pride. "Thank you," she said instead, and they began the long walk back toward the ranch house together, the flooded creek falling behind them, though neither of them yet understood how much would come to depend, before the season turned, on the fact that Chester Hadley had happened to be within earshot of a runaway horse on a wet Tuesday in May. The Leland Ranch sat on nearly 9,000 acres of rolling foothill country between Sonora and the Stanislaus River, land that Thomas Leland had built up over 15 years from a modest cattle claim into one of the largest spreads in the district, fattened first by beef sold to hungry gold camps, and later by the steadier business of driving herds to the growing markets of Stockton and Sacramento. He had died the previous November, thrown from a wagon on the Sonora Road when a wheel struck a rut in the dark, leaving behind 11,000 head of cattle, 4,000 acres of deeded land and 5,000 more claimed by grazing right, and one daughter, 22 years old, unmarried, and by his own will named sole heir to all of it. He had also, in a decision that Delia had spent 6 months coming to regret with a bitterness, she tried hard not to let curdle into something uglier, named his late wife's half-brother, Cyrus Whitlock, as guardian of the estate until Delia's 23rd birthday or her marriage, whichever came first, on the theory that a young woman alone needed a steady hand to help her manage so large a fortune, until she had a husband to share the weight of it. Thomas Leland had meant it kindly. Cyrus Whitlock had received it as a gift from heaven. Delia had known, within a month of her father's funeral, that something was wrong. Cyrus had come from his failed mining venture near Columbia with 2 trunks and a great deal of charm, had settled into the best guest room, and had begun, gently at first and then with increasing firmness, to relieve Delia of every duty her father had trained her to for the last 6 years. She had kept the household accounts since she was 16. She had negotiated with cattle buyers at her father's elbow since she was 18. She had known every hand on the payroll by name, knew which cows were due to calve, and which fences needed mending before the foreman had to tell her. And in the space of 6 months, Cyrus Whitlock had taken the ledgers from her hands, telling her that a lady ought not to trouble herself with such figures, had begun meeting with cattle buyers alone, and had, with a smile that never quite reached his pale eyes, suggested to the household that Delia's grief over her father had left her nerves too delicate for such burdens. He had not sent her out of the house. That would have raised questions among the hands who had known her since childhood. Instead, he had done something crueler and more effective. He had put her in the kitchen. It was framed always as kindness. Poor Delia, so overtaxed by grief, might find comfort in simpler work while she recovered her strength. And because the ranch's previous cook, old Manuela Ochoa, had died of a lung fever that same terrible winter, there was a genuine need, and Delia, refusing to simply sit idle in a parlor while strangers ran her father's ranch into whatever shape Cyrus intended for it, had taken up the challenge with a stubbornness that surprised even her. She had discovered to her own quiet satisfaction that she was good at it. Feeding 18 ranch hands 3 times a day, on a budget Cyrus made deliberately thin, required the same skills her father had always praised in her: organization, foresight, an ability to make hard men do what needed doing without raising her voice. She kept a garden going through the dry months by hauling water herself when the well ran low. She stretched beef and beans and cornbread into meals that kept the crew strong through branding season, and calving season, and the long, wet misery of this particular spring. The hands, who had once called her Miss Delia with the easy affection of men who had watched her grow up, now called her that with something closer to respect, because she fed them well, and never let a single one of them go hungry or unheard, even as Cyrus Whitlock cut every other corner he could find. It was not the life her father had intended for her, but she had made of it something that was, in its own way, hers, and she told herself most days that this was enough, that she would endure Cyrus's guardianship as she must until her 23rd birthday in October, and then reclaim what belonged to her. She did not yet know that Cyrus Whitlock had no intention of allowing that birthday to arrive with her inheritance still in her own hands. Chester Hadley had come to the foothills of Tuolumne County 3 years before, in the spring of 1851, following the same fever that had drawn 100,000 others west, though by the time he arrived the easy gold along the river bars was long since picked over by men faster and luckier than he was. He had worked a claim near Sonora for 8 months with his wife Mary at his side, boiling coffee over a fire while he worked a rocker in the icy water, and when the claim gave out, he had done what a great many disappointed miners did. He had bought 40 acres of foothill land cheap from a man heading home to Missouri, built a cabin, and turned to farming and raising a few head of stock instead. Mary had died in the second winter, of a fever that swept through the camps and settlements that year and took the strong along with the weak, showing no particular respect for a woman only 24 years old with her whole life still ahead of her. Chester had buried her on a low rise above the cabin, under an oak tree that would, come autumn, drop its leaves over the small stone he had carved her name into himself, and he had told himself in the 2 years since that he had found a kind of peace in the solitude that followed. It was not peace. He understood that now, walking beside Delia Leland with a lathered mare between them and rain running cold down the back of his collar, though he could not yet have said what word he would use instead. It was something more like a held breath, a careful stillness he had built around himself so nothing else could get in and hurt him the way losing Mary had hurt him. He worked his own land. He hired out for fence work and branding when cash was short, which was often, since a small homestead in a wet year produced less than a man needed to live on. He came to town twice a month for supplies and spoke to perhaps a dozen people in the course of it. He had told himself this was contentment. But there had been something in the way Delia Leland had looked up at him from the wet grass, more annoyed than frightened, already calculating how to get back on her feet rather than waiting to be rescued, that had cracked something open in his careful stillness. And he found himself, as they walked the last half-mile toward the ranch house, unable to stop glancing sideways at her. "You need not walk all the way to the house," she told him for perhaps the third time as the roofline came into view through the rain. "You have your own fence to finish, and I have kept you from it long enough." "The fence will keep till tomorrow," Chester said. "It has kept for longer than that already on account of this rain. I would rather see you sat down by a fire before I go back to it. You are stubborn." "I have been told that before, yes, ma'am." "By whom?" The question came out before she considered whether it was her business to ask, and she saw something flicker across his face, there and gone, before he answered. "My wife used to say it." She had a gift for finding the exact word for a man's faults and saying it plain without much cruelty in it, just truth. "Your wife," Delia said carefully. "I am sorry, I did not know. No reason you would." He kept his eyes on the muddy trail ahead, his voice even, though there was a rawness underneath it that told her the wound was not so old as he might wish it to be. "She has been gone 2 years this winter. Fever took her. I do not speak of it much, but I do not mind you asking." Some folks tiptoe so far around a grief, they never let a man say the person's name out loud again, and that is its own kind of unkindness. Delia thought of her father, 6 months gone, and how Cyrus Whitlock had a habit of changing the subject whenever she mentioned him, as though grief were an embarrassment to be managed rather than a thing to be spoken plainly. "Her name was Mary," she said. "It was not a question." "Mary Hadley." "Yes." He glanced at her, surprised, and something eased in his shoulders, as though the saying of it had cost him less than he expected. "How did you know to ask that particular way?" "Because I have buried someone too, this last winter, and I have found that most people would rather talk about anything else than let me say his name." They reached the yard in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and Chester handed Juniper's reins to a stable boy who came running at the sight of them, and stood for a moment in the rain outside the kitchen door while Delia paused on the threshold. "Come in and get warm before you start back," she said. "It is the least I can offer a man who kept me out of the creek. I have coffee on, and I imagine you have not eaten since sunup." He should have said no. He had learned, in 2 years alone, that the safest thing was always to say no to warmth offered by a kind face, because warmth had a way of becoming necessary, and necessary things could be taken away. But the rain was cold, and the kitchen window glowed gold, and Delia Leland was already holding the door for him, and Chester Hadley found that, for the first time in longer than he could easily account for, he did not want to say no. "I would be obliged," he said, and followed her inside. The kitchen was Delia's true kingdom, and stepping into it after the gray chill of the yard felt, to Chester, like stepping into a different season altogether. A great iron stove threw heat into every corner. Strings of dried chilies hung from the rafters alongside bundles of sage and yarrow, and the long table that ran the length of the room bore the scars of 1,000 meals hacked out on its surface. 2 ranch hands sat near the stove mending harness leather, and they looked up with open curiosity at the sight of Chester Hadley dripping on the kitchen floor. "Miss Delia, you are soaked through," said the older of the two, a broad, gray-whiskered man Chester recognized as Roy Calloway, the ranch's longtime foreman. "What in creation happened out there?" "Juniper bolted at the creek crossing," Delia said, already moving to the stove, Already reaching for the coffee pot with the ease of long habit even as her hands, Chester noticed, trembled slightly with the last of the shock. Mr. Hadley here turned her before she hit the water. I would very likely be in Knight's Ferry by now, in pieces if not for him. Roy Calloway's weathered face went through several expressions in quick succession, arriving finally at something like profound gratitude mixed with an older man's habitual suspicion of any hand who got too close to the boss's daughter. He rose and shook Chester's hand with a grip that tested as much as it thanked. "We are in your debt, Hadley. I will see it noted for you, something extra in your pay this month." "No need," Chester said. "Any man would have done the same, seeing what I saw." "Not every man would have caught up to her in time," Delia said quietly, setting a steaming cup in front of him at the table. "Sit, warm yourself. You have earned that much at the very least." He sat, because it seemed rude not to, and because the coffee smelled better than anything he had tasted in longer than he wanted to admit, and because there was something in the easy command of Delia Leland moving through her kitchen, directing the hands, checking the beans on the stove, cutting bread for him without being asked, that he found he did not want to walk away from just yet. It was in that kitchen, over the following weeks, that whatever had cracked open in him at the flooded creek crossing began, slowly and without either of them quite naming it, to grow. Cyrus Whitlock arrived in the kitchen doorway some 20 minutes later, drawn, Delia suspected, by word from one of the hands that something had happened out on the East Range. He was a tall man of perhaps 50, still handsome in the way of men who had once been very handsome and had not yet noticed the difference, dressed always a shade too finely for a working ranch, with pale eyes that missed very little and a smile that Delia had come, over 6 months, to distrust more with every passing week. "Delia." His voice carried the particular gentleness he used when other people were present, the tone of a devoted guardian concerned for a fragile ward. "I heard there was some trouble at the creek. Are you injured?" "Bruised, nothing more," Delia said. "Thanks to Mr. Hadley here who caught Juniper before she reached the water." Cyrus's gaze moved to Chester with a flicker of assessment, the look of a man cataloging whether someone was useful, dangerous, or beneath notice. "The fence man. Yes, I recall hiring you on. Well, you have done the ranch a service, I will grant you that. We are grateful." "Just glad I was near enough to help," Chester said, and something in his flat, unimpressed tone told Delia he had already taken the measure of Cyrus Whitlock and found him wanting, in the quick, quiet way of men who spent their lives reading horses and weather and knew when something did not sit right. "Well," Cyrus's smile widened though it did not reach his eyes. "Delia, my dear, perhaps you ought to rest this afternoon rather than troubling yourself with supper preparations. You have had a fright." "I am quite capable of managing a kitchen after a fall from a horse, Cyrus," Delia said, an edge creeping into her voice despite her effort to keep it out. "I have managed worse." Of course. He held up a placating hand, though his eyes had gone momentarily cold before the smile smoothed it over again. "I only worry for you. You know that." He withdrew soon after, and Delia felt the tension go out of the room with his departure, watched Roy Calloway's shoulders unknot, saw even the hands mending harness breathe a little easier. It was a small thing, that collective exhale, but Chester Hadley noticed it and filed it away with the same careful attention he gave to a fence post that did not sit quite plumb in the ground. "He does not care for you managing your own kitchen," Chester observed quietly, once Cyrus's footsteps had faded down the hall. "He does not care for me managing anything," Delia said, and then seemed to catch herself, glancing at him as though surprised she had said so much to a man she had known for less than a single afternoon. "Forgive me. That is ranch business, not fence business. A fence only holds if a man understands what it is meant to keep in and what it is meant to keep out," Chester said. "I do not need to know your business to see there is a fence somewhere in this house that is not holding the way it ought." Delia looked at him for a long moment, something considering in her expression, and then, for the first time since her father's funeral, she found herself almost smiling. "You are a strange sort of fence-mender, Mr. Hadley." "I have been told that too," he said, and finished his coffee, and went back out into the rain to walk the 4 miles home, though he found, oddly, that the walk did not feel nearly as long or as lonely as it usually did. The weeks that followed carried the ranch deeper into the wet heart of the foothill spring. The hills that had been merely green in April turned riotous with color by the second week of May. Poppies and lupin and owl's clover spreading gold and purple and pink across every slope that had not been grazed too hard. And even the working hands, men not given to noticing such things, remarked that they could not recall a season so beautiful or so thoroughly ruined by rain. Coyote Creek stayed high and dangerous for a fortnight after Delia's near drowning, and 2 other crossings along the county road washed out entirely, cutting the ranch off from Sonora proper for the better part of a week, and forcing everyone into an uneasy, isolated rhythm of work. Chester Hadley came to the ranch 3, sometimes 4 days a week through those weeks, resetting posts along 4 miles of boundary fence that the winter's storms had knocked half to ruin, and it became, without either of them quite planning it, a habit that he would end his day's work at the kitchen door, and Delia would have coffee and whatever bread or pie had come out of the oven that afternoon waiting for him, and they would talk. It was never a long conversation. Ranch work did not allow for that, and Chester's own homestead needed tending in whatever daylight remained. But it accumulated, the way small things do, into something larger than the sum of its minutes. He told her in pieces about the claim he and Mary had worked, about the disappointment of the diggings and the quieter satisfaction of turning to the land instead. She told him about her father, about learning the cattle business at his side since she was old enough to sit a saddle, about the particular ache of losing him so suddenly that she had never gotten to say the things a daughter means to say to a father before he is gone. "He was proud of you," Chester said once, when she had spoken of her father with more grief in her voice than she usually allowed herself. "Any man could see that in the way this ranch runs. You keep 18 hands fed and working and content on a budget that would starve a lesser crew into rebellion. That does not happen by accident. Cyrus does not see it that way. Cyrus," Chester said carefully, "does not strike me as a man who sees very much beyond his own advantage." Delia had said nothing to that, though she had thought about it long after Chester had walked home through the lingering gold light of the long spring evening, because it was the first time anyone besides Roy Calloway had said aloud what she had begun, with growing unease, to suspect herself. The suitors began arriving in earnest in the first week of June, and Delia understood, with each new face at her father's table, that Cyrus's patience with the merely social arrangement of her guardianship was thinning. Everett Prout came first, the son of a Sonora banker who held a considerable note against Cyrus's failed mining venture, a fact Delia did not learn until much later, but which explained, once she did learn it, a great deal about the eagerness with which Cyrus pressed the young man's suit. Everett was handsome in a soft, well-fed way, dressed in a fine coat entirely unsuited to ranch country, and possessed a habit of addressing all his conversation to Cyrus, even when the subject was, ostensibly, Delia herself, as though she were a piece of property whose merits were best discussed with her owner. "Your daughter has a fine hand for management, I am told," Everett said over supper, glancing at Delia only briefly before returning his attention to Cyrus. "Though of course once married, a lady's energies are better spent on her household than on cattle ledgers." "Quite right," Cyrus agreed, with a warmth he never showed Delia herself. "Delia will make an excellent wife for the right man. A steady hand is all she requires to flourish." Delia had sat through the meal with her jaw tight and her hands folded in her lap, saying as little as courtesy allowed, and had gone to bed that night more furious than she had been in months. The second suitor, a mining speculator named Jasper Kane, who had done well enough in the later gold strikes to style himself a gentleman, was worse in a different way, his eyes lingering on Delia with an appraisal that had nothing to do with her management of ledgers, and everything to do with the acreage that would come attached to her hand. Delia had excused herself from that supper early, claiming a headache, and had gone instead to the kitchen, where she found herself, 20 minutes later, still fuming, cutting vegetables for the next day's stew with rather more force than the carrots strictly required. It was there that Chester found her, having come by after dark to return a borrowed maul, and taken one look at her face before asking, "Who put that look on you?" "A parade of men my uncle seems determined I should marry," Delia said, not looking up from the cutting board. "Each one worse than the last. Tonight's specimen looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he is considering buying, checking my teeth, so to speak, though he was polite enough not to actually reach for my jaw." Chester's expression darkened in a way she had not seen from him before, something protective and sharp beneath his usual calm. "That is no way to treat a woman. It is the way men treat cattle they mean to purchase," Delia said. "And I have begun to suspect that is precisely how Cyrus intends me, though I could not say yet what he stands to gain from selling me to the highest bidder." She had not meant to say so much. It surprised her, the ease with which words came loose around Chester Hadley that she kept locked tight around everyone else, even Roy Calloway, who she trusted with her life but not somehow with the raw uncertainty of her fears. Chester did not offer easy comfort or false reassurance. He simply pulled out a chair, sat across the table from her, and said, "Tell me what you know and what you only suspect, and we will see if there is a pattern in it." And so, over the ruin of a pile of carrots neither of them finished, Delia told him what she had begun to piece together over the preceding weeks. The ledgers Cyrus kept locked away from her now. The cattle sales she heard about second-hand from buyers in town rather than from her own guardian. The letters that arrived for Cyrus from Sonora and were burned in the study fireplace rather than left lying about. The way Everett Prute's father held a note against Cyrus's old mining claim that Cyrus seemed unusually eager to have forgiven. "It sounds," Chester said slowly when she had finished, "as though your uncle has debts he cannot pay and a ranch he is not entitled to keep and needs your marriage to solve one problem or the other or both together." "That is my fear as well," Delia admitted, "but I have no proof, only suspicion and a locked desk drawer I do not have the key to." "Then get the proof," Chester said simply. "You are not a woman who waits helplessly for things to happen to her, Delia Leland. I have watched you run this kitchen and this crew for 2 months now. Find the proof and take it to a lawyer who is not beholden to your uncle, and let the law do what your uncle cannot argue with." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and they both seemed to notice it at the same moment, a small silence falling over the kitchen table that had nothing to do with Cyrus Whitlock or forged papers or unwanted suitors. "You called me Delia," she said. "I did," Chester agreed, unashamed of it, though a faint color had risen along his jaw. "I hope I have not overstepped." "No," Delia said, and found that she meant it more than she had expected to. "I think I should like it if you continued to." "Then you may call me Chester," he said, "if it pleases you too." "It pleases me," Delia said, and smiled at him across the ruined carrots, and understood, in that quiet golden moment in her father's kitchen with the rain drumming soft against the windows, that whatever this was growing between them had already gone past the point where either of them could easily call it back. The proof, when it came, arrived not through any clever scheme but through simple accident, the way the truth so often does. Delia had taken to rising before dawn to do the ranch's supply ordering herself, a task Cyrus had not thought worth taking from her since it touched only the kitchen budget and not the larger cattle accounts, and it was in going through the previous month's receipts from the Sonora Mercantile that she found, tucked among the ordinary bills, a letter that had clearly been meant for Cyrus's desk and had been delivered instead by some clerk's error to the kitchen pile. It was from a lawyer in Sonora named Otis Abernathy, though not, she quickly understood, a lawyer Cyrus had hired for honest purposes. The letter referenced, in careful legal language that nonetheless could not disguise its meaning, a codicil to Thomas Leland's will that Cyrus wished drawn up, one that would extend his guardianship of the estate beyond Delia's 23rd birthday, unless she married a husband approved specifically by her guardian. And further, that should she resist or prove uncooperative, the codicil would allow Cyrus to have her examined and declared of unsound mind, on the grounds of grief-induced nervous collapse, thereby extending his control indefinitely. Delia read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to move. Her father's actual will, which she had read at the time of his death and remembered clearly, named her sole heir with no such provision. This was a forgery in progress, a false codicil meant to be presented as though it had always existed, and the lawyer Abernathy, whatever his moral failings, had apparently balked at some detail, for the letter ended with a request for additional payment before he would put his name to the finished document. She did not go to Cyrus. She did not confront him, though every instinct in her screamed to do so. Instead, with hands that shook only slightly, she copied the letter's contents word for word into her own hand, replaced the original exactly where she had found it, and rode that same morning, alone and before the household had fully woken to Sonora, to find a lawyer of her own. The lawyer she found, a serious young man named Thaddeus Whitfield, who had only that winter hung his shingle in town, and was eager enough for reputable business that he took her seriously, rather than dismissing her as a hysterical young woman, listened to her story with a gathering frown and agreed, after examining her copy of the letter, that what she described sounded very much like fraud, and dangerous fraud at that. If this codicil is presented and accepted by the county court, Whitfield told her, your uncle could indeed extend his control over your inheritance indefinitely, provided he can also establish grounds to declare you incompetent. That second part will be harder for him to prove than the first, provided you have witnesses to your soundness of mind and management. Do you have such witnesses? 18 ranch hands who have eaten 3 meals a day from my kitchen for 6 months, Delia said, and a foreman who has known me since I was 7 years old. That is a good beginning, Whitfield said, but we will need your father's original will, filed properly, to compare against whatever your uncle attempts to present. Do you know where that document is kept? In Cyrus's locked desk drawer, Delia said grimly, along with, I suspect, whatever forged version he means to substitute for it. It was Chester who suggested, 2 days later, how the original will might be recovered without alerting Cyrus to what was coming. Every desk has a key somewhere that is not the lock itself, he said, when Delia laid the problem before him in the kitchen one evening, the rain having finally eased into the softer, more forgiving showers of true late spring. My father kept his strongbox key hung on a nail behind a picture frame his whole life, thinking no one would guess it. Ask around the house. See if anyone has noticed your uncle behave carelessly with a key, even once. It was Roy Calloway, brought carefully into their confidence, who solved it, recalling that Cyrus kept a small brass key on his watch chain that he was never without except when he bathed, at which time his valet, a taciturn man named Grissom who had come with Cyrus from Columbia and answered to him alone, would lay the watch and chain on the wash stand outside the bathing room. The theft, if it could be called theft when the document belonged rightfully to Delia in the first place, took less than 4 minutes on a Sunday afternoon when Cyrus had gone to bathe before an evening meeting with Everett Prout's father. Delia let herself into the study, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the whole house must hear it, unlocked the desk with the borrowed key, and found, exactly as she had hoped, her father's original will, still bearing the county recorder's seal, along with a half-finished draft of the false codicil in Cyrus's own hand, unmistakably matching the language Abernathy's letter had described. She took both documents, relocked the desk, returned the key to its place on the watch chain before Cyrus emerged from his bath, and rode for Sonora again the following morning with proof enough, Whitfield assured her, to bring the matter before a judge. It was, in the strange way of such things, the very success of this quiet victory that brought the danger to its head, for Cyrus Whitlock discovered the theft of his draft codicil within days, and understood at once, with the cold clarity of a cornered man, that his niece was no longer merely an obstacle to be managed, but an active threat to be dealt with before she could bring the matter to court. It was Roy Calloway who first proposed the marriage of convenience, some 10 days after the theft of the documents, when Cyrus's mood had turned dark and watchful and word had reached the kitchen, through Grissom's careless talk with the stable hands, that Cyrus intended to move up the date of Delia's marriage to Everett Prout, forcing the ceremony before the matter could reach any judge's desk. "If you marry before he can force Prout on you," Roy said, laying it out plainly one evening after the crew had gone to their bunks, with only Delia and Chester left at the kitchen table, "then whatever guardianship your uncle claims dissolves the moment you take a husband of your own choosing. It is in your father's actual will, plain as day. A married woman answers to her husband, not her guardian in the eyes of the county court. Whitfield confirmed it himself. And you think I should marry in haste to whoever will have me simply to spite Cyrus?" Delia asked, though her eyes had gone without her quite meaning them to Chester across the table. "I think," Roy said carefully, "that you need a husband you trust standing beside you before your uncle can put Prout in that place instead. It need not be a marriage of the heart, Miss Delia. Plenty of marriages in this territory are made for practical reasons and grow into something warmer later, or do not, and the parties live respectably enough regardless. I only mean to say the law does not ask why two people marry, only that they have." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Delia felt her face grow warm, and she made herself look at Chester directly rather than let the suggestion sit unaddressed between them like something shameful. "Chester," she said, "you must not feel obligated by anything Roy has said. I would not ask a man to bind himself to my troubles out of duty." "It would not be duty," Chester said slowly, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "But I will not lie to you, Delia. I do not think I could stand up in a church and speak vows meant only as a legal maneuver, not even for you, not even to save this ranch from your uncle. I made those vows once already to marry, and meant every word of them. I do not think I have it in me to say them again as a kind of paperwork." It was, Delia realized with a strange mixture of disappointment and relief, exactly the answer she had hoped he would give, though she had not known it until she heard it. "I feel the same," she admitted. "I have watched Everett Prout and Jasper Kane sit at my father's table and treat marriage to me as a transaction, a fair price for good grazing land, and I find I would rather lose this ranch entirely than become, in truth, no better a bargain in your eyes than I was in theirs. If I marry Chester Hadley, I want it to mean what my father's marriage to my mother meant. I do not want it to be a strategy." "Then we will find another way to beat your uncle," Chester said. "And if some day marriage comes between us, let it come because we have chosen it freely, with nothing false or forced about it, not because a lawyer told us it was the fastest road out of danger." Roy Calloway, watching the two of them across the table, said nothing more that evening, though the look on his weathered face suggested he had already guessed at an outcome neither Delia nor Chester was yet ready to speak aloud. Cyrus Whitlock did not wait for the wheels of the county court to turn. Word came to the ranch on a warm night in late June, carried by a breathless stable boy who had overheard Grissom speaking with two rough-looking men who had ridden in from the direction of the old mining camps near Columbia, men with the particular hardened look of former claim jumpers and camp toughs who had found honest work scarcer than dishonest, and who now, it seemed, worked for whoever paid best. Cyrus meant to force the matter that very night. Everett Prout and a traveling preacher were being brought to the ranch under cover of darkness, along with enough armed men to ensure that whatever protest Delia might raise would be overruled. And by morning, before Whitfield or any judge could intervene, Delia Leland would be a married woman, and Cyrus Whitlock's control of the Leland fortune would be secured through her new husband, a young man already deeply in his debt. Delia received this news in the kitchen with a calm that surprised even herself, the calm of a woman who has spent months preparing, without fully realizing it, for exactly this moment. "How many men?" she asked the stable boy, whose name was Pablo and who could not have been more than 14. "6, maybe 7, Miss Delia. Grissom and the 2 rough ones and some others I did not see close." "Roy," Delia said, turning to her foreman, "how many hands do we have we can trust absolutely tonight to stand against Cyrus if it comes to that?" Roy Calloway's face had gone hard and old soldier grim. "Every man on this crew has eaten your bread for 6 months and watched how your uncle treats you. I would trust all 18, but half are out with the herd on the North Range and will not be back before dark falls proper. I can raise perhaps 10 men here at the house within the hour plus myself." "That may not be enough against armed men expecting no resistance," Delia said, thinking fast now, the fear beneath her calm giving way to something sharper and more useful. "Send someone for Chester, and send another rider to the Hendricks place and the Molina farm, both bordering our land. They have no love for Cyrus, and my father did them more than one good turn over the years that they might remember tonight." It was full dark by the time Chester arrived, having ridden the 4 miles from his own homestead at a dead gallop, the moment Roy's messenger reached him, and found the ranch house lit only dimly, deliberately, curtains drawn, an unnatural quiet lying over a yard that was, in truth, humming with careful preparation. "Tell me what you need," he said to Delia, finding her in the kitchen loading a shotgun with hands that were, he noted with quiet pride, entirely steady. "I need Cyrus's men to believe this house is asleep and undefended until it is too late for them to retreat cleanly," Delia said. "I do not want blood spilled tonight, Chester, not Cyrus's men and not ours. I want this ended in a way that puts my uncle in front of a judge, not in a grave, and does not leave good men's deaths on my conscience for something as ugly as this." It was Chester, drawing on instincts sharpened by 2 years of scraping a living from difficult land, and a lifetime of understanding how men behaved when they thought themselves unwatched, who shaped the plan that followed, with Roy Calloway's knowledge of the ranch's layout filling in what Chester could not know. Lanterns were lit and left burning in the bunkhouse to suggest the hands were settled in for the night, while in truth the 10 trusted men, along with 3 riders from the Hendricks and Molina farms who arrived within the hour, took up positions in the darkness beyond the light's reach, along the fence lines and behind the barn, and in the deep shadow of the cottonwoods that lined the drive. Delia herself remained visible in the house, moving past a lit window now and again, as though preparing for an ordinary evening, while the true defenders waited unseen. The riders came just before midnight, exactly as Pablo had warned, moving up the drive with the confidence of men who expected no trouble. Cyrus in the lead beside a nervous Everett Prout and a preacher who looked, even at a distance, deeply unhappy with his errand, followed by Grissom and 4 hired men whose hard faces caught the moonlight when they passed beneath the cottonwoods. What happened next unfolded not as a battle, for Delia had been insistent that it must not become one, but as a carefully staged unraveling. As the riders reached the yard, Roy Calloway stepped out from the shadow of the barn, rifle held loose but visible, and called out in a voice that carried easily across the quiet. "That is far enough, Mr. Whitlock. You will want to turn around." Cyrus, startled but recovering quickly, called back with forced confidence. "This is my ward's home, Calloway, and my business here is family business. Stand aside." "Your ward does not care for the company you have brought her," Roy answered, and at that signal, torches were lit along the fence line, one after another, each one revealing another armed rider positioned at intervals. Chester and Roy had chosen precisely to make the ranch's defenders appear far more numerous than they truly were. The hired toughs, who had come expecting an easy job against a household of women and old men, found themselves instead facing what looked, in the flickering torchlight, like 20 or more armed men ringing the yard on every side. It was Chester who stepped forward next from the porch itself, having taken up a position near enough to Delia that he could reach her in an instant if the standoff turned violent, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the flat, unhurried authority of a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. "Mr. Whitlock, we have your forged codicil in your own hand, along with a letter from a Sonora lawyer detailing the fraud you intended. Miss Leland's attorney has copies lodged with the county court already. Whatever happens here tonight, that document will be examined by a judge within the week. The only question left for you to answer is whether you ride away now, quietly, or whether these good men here have cause to make tonight a good deal more memorable for you." A long, taut silence followed, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the distant call of a night bird somewhere down toward the creek. Delia watched from the porch, her shotgun no longer hidden but held with visible readiness, and saw the exact moment Cyrus's composure cracked. "You have no proof that would stand," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how little he believed his own words. "We have your handwriting," Delia called out, stepping forward to stand beside Chester, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "We have Mr. Abernathy's letter demanding further payment for a forged document. We have Roy Calloway and 18 ranch hands prepared to swear before any judge that I have managed this household and this crew with a sound mind these 6 months past, feeding every man here better than you ever thought to. And we have every neighbor within 10 miles who remembers what my father did for them, and who will not stand by while you steal his legacy through fraud and force." It was Grissom, of all people, who broke first, the valet turning his horse's head without a word and riding back the way he had come, and his desertion seemed to loosen something in the other hired men, who exchanged uneasy glances in the torchlight and began, one by one, to follow suit, unwilling to risk their necks in a fight that had clearly already been lost before the first shot could be fired. Everett Prout, for his part, looked as though he had never wanted to be present at all, and mumbled something about a misunderstanding before turning his horse and departing with rather more haste than dignity, the preacher close behind him, muttering what might have been a prayer of relief. That left Cyrus Whitlock alone in the yard, his fine coat suddenly looking absurd in the torchlight, facing a niece he had badly underestimated, and a ring of armed men who had not fired a single shot and did not in the end need to. "This is not finished," Cyrus said, though the words carried no real threat left in them, only the last defiant gasp of a man who knew he had lost. "No," Delia agreed. "It will finish in front of Judge Harrington in Sonora, where you will answer for fraud and attempted extortion, and where I expect Mr. Abernathy will find it very much in his interest to testify fully once he understands the alternative is prosecution alongside you. Ride home tonight, Cyrus. I will send for you when the court requires your presence, and not before." Cyrus Whitlock rode away from the Leland ranch that night with nothing left of the smooth confidence he had arrived with 6 months before, and though the matter would indeed take some weeks to work its way fully through the county court, the true battle, everyone in that yard understood, had already been decided, not by gunfire, but by preparation, allies earned through genuine kindness, and a young woman who had refused to be managed into helplessness. It was in the quiet aftermath, as the torches were extinguished one by one, and the borrowed riders from the Hendricks and Molina farms began the ride home with Roy Calloway's heartfelt thanks ringing after them, that Delia finally allowed herself to sag, the enormous effort of the evening's calm finally spending itself, and it was Chester who caught her elbow, steadying her the way he had steadied her that first day at the creek. "You did that," he said quietly, once they were alone on the porch, the yard emptying around them. "All of it. The proof, the plan, the courage to stand in that yard and face him down. I do not think I have ever seen anything braver." "I could not have done it without you," Delia said, and found, in the exhausted honesty of the moment, that she did not want to pretend otherwise. "Without Roy, without you turning that codicil into a plan I could actually use, without you standing beside me tonight when I did not know if my legs would hold me up much longer." "I did not do very much," Chester said. "I only stood where you needed me to stand." "That is not a small thing," Delia said. That is, I think, the largest thing a person can do for another. To simply be where they are needed, without demanding to be thanked for it, without making it about anything but the need itself. They stood together a long moment on the porch, the last of the torchlight dying away, the wildflower-scented night settling soft and cool around them, and Delia found herself studying his face in the moonlight, the tiredness in it, the quiet steadiness that had not once wavered through the entire terrible evening, and understood with a clarity that felt like the sun breaking through weeks of rain, exactly what it was she had been feeling for him since a runaway horse had first thrown her into his path. "Chester," she said, "I owe you an honest word, and I find I am tired enough tonight to simply say it rather than dance around it as good manners might otherwise demand." "Say it then," he said, and something in his voice told her he already suspected what was coming and wanted very much to hear it regardless. "I do not want you to stand beside me only when danger requires it," Delia said. "I find that I want you beside me on ordinary days as well, quiet ones, boring ones even, where nothing at all happens except that we are together. I think I have wanted that for some weeks now, and I was too occupied fighting my uncle to properly notice it. But I notice it now, standing here, and I did not want to let the feeling pass without saying so." Chester was quiet for a moment, and Delia, watching his face, saw something move across it that looked almost like fear, though not the fear of a coward, rather the fear of a man who has spent 2 years convincing himself he did not deserve to feel what he was, in that moment, plainly feeling. "I buried Mary thinking I had used up whatever capacity I had for this," he said slowly. "I told myself the solitude I built around my cabin was peace, and I believed it mostly, because believing anything else felt like a betrayal of what she and I had. But I have been riding to this ranch 3 and 4 days a week for 2 months now, Delia, and I do not think it has been for the fence work. I think I have been finding reasons to see you, and telling myself it was only friendship, because friendship felt like something I was allowed to have. And now," Delia asked, her heart beating hard enough that she was certain he must hear it in the quiet night air. "Now I think it would be a lie to keep calling it only friendship," Chester said, and reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished to, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I love you, Delia Leland. I have been afraid to say it because I did not know if loving again was a thing I was permitted to do, but I find I do not want to be careful about it any longer. Not after tonight. Not after watching you stand in that yard and refuse to be anyone's helpless bargain." "I love you too," Delia said, the words coming easier than she had expected, as though they had been waiting a long while for permission to be spoken. "And I do not want a marriage of convenience, Chester. I want this. I want you freely chosen, with nothing false in it and nothing forced." He kissed her then, softly, there on the porch in the cool wildflower-scented dark, with the last embers of the torches dying in the yard behind them and the whole difficult season finally beginning to turn toward something gentler. And Delia Leland understood in that moment that whatever came next in the courts, whatever final reckoning awaited Cyrus Whitlock, she had already won the thing that mattered most. The weeks that followed brought the practical resolution that the night's confrontation had made possible. Otis Abernathy, the lawyer who had drafted the false codicil, proved as cowardly as Cyrus had been desperate, and upon being visited by Thaddeus Whitfield with the threat of prosecution for his own role in the fraud, produced a full written confession in exchange for leniency, detailing exactly how Cyrus Whitlock had commissioned the forged document and how much he had offered to pay for it. This confession, combined with Delia's original copy of Cyrus's incriminating letter and the testimony of Roy Calloway and a dozen ranch hands as to Delia's evident competence, proved more than sufficient for Judge Harrington in Sonora. Cyrus Whitlock did not go to prison, for the fraud had not in the end been fully completed, only attempted, and Judge Harrington was inclined toward practical resolution over harsh punishment in a county still finding its legal footing. But his guardianship was dissolved entirely, and immediately, his access to the Leland accounts revoked, and he was ordered to repay, from whatever remained of his own dwindling funds, the sums he had already diverted from the estate over the preceding 6 months. He left Tuolumne County within the month, bound, by rumor that reached the ranch second-hand, for some fresh scheme in the mining camps of Nevada, and Delia found that she felt, upon hearing of his departure, not triumph exactly, but a clean and simple relief, the relief of a fence finally mended after long neglect, holding once more what it was meant to hold. Everett Pruitt's father, embarrassed by his son's near involvement in an attempted fraud, quietly forgave the note he held against Cyrus rather than see the matter dragged further into public scrutiny, and Everett himself was not seen at the Leland ranch again, though Delia heard, some months later, that he had married a banker's daughter from Stockton, and seemed, by all accounts, content enough with a bargain more suited to his temperament. Delia Leland came into her full inheritance that August, 2 months shy of her 23rd birthday. The ranch and its 11,000 head of cattle and its 9,000 acres restored entirely to her own management, with Roy Calloway remaining at her side as foreman and trusted advisor, exactly as her father had always intended before Cyrus Whitlock's ambition had complicated things. She kept the kitchen going a while longer even after her authority was restored, training up a capable young woman named Consuelo to take over the daily cooking, not because she needed to any longer, but because she had come, over that strange and difficult season, to love the work itself, the daily rhythm of feeding people well, and she did not intend to give it up entirely simply because she no longer had to prove anything by doing it. Chester Hadley finished the boundary fence between the Leland Ranch and his own homestead in the first week of July. 4 miles of new cedar posts and taut wire standing straight and true where winter storms had left the old line broken. And it was there, along that very fence, on a warm evening in late July with the wildflowers gone to seed, and the hills turning gold with the approach of summer, that he asked Delia Leland to marry him. He had no grand speech prepared, though he had thought about it for days, turning over words that all seemed too small for what he meant to say. In the end, he simply took her hand as they walked the fence line together, checking his work as she often liked to do with him in the cooling evenings, and said, "Delia, I have built one home already and lost the woman I built it for, and I told myself I would not risk that grief again. But I find that the fear of losing you frightens me a great deal less than the thought of a life spent never asking, 'Will you marry me?' Not because any lawyer or any danger requires it, but because I cannot any longer imagine an ordinary evening that does not have you in it." Delia, who had spent 6 months learning exactly what she wanted and refusing every arrangement that offered her anything less, did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, "Chester Hadley, yes, 1,000 times yes, and gladly." And he kissed her there against the new mended fence with the setting sun turning the whole gold hillside to fire around them, and neither of them thought, in that moment, of anything they had lost, only of everything they had, at last and against every hard turn the season had thrown at them, found. They were married in September, in the yard of the Leland Ranch house under an arch woven from the last of the summer's wildflowers, with Roy Calloway standing as witness for Chester, who had no family left in the territory to call upon, and with every hand on the ranch crew present, having come to genuinely love the woman who had fed them faithfully through the hardest season any of them could remember. Chester sold his small homestead that same autumn, not out of any diminishment of what he and Mary had built there, but because he and Delia agreed, after long and honest conversation, that his experience with fences and land and hard work would serve the larger Leland Ranch well, and that Mary's memory deserved to be honored rather than abandoned. He moved her small gravestone, with careful reverence and Delia's full blessing, to a quiet oak grove on the Leland land itself, where it could be tended properly rather than left to the slow neglect of an empty homestead, and Delia herself planted wildflowers around the stone that first spring of their marriage, understanding without being told that love, properly held, made room for what had come before rather than erasing it. Chester took up a role at Delia's side, managing the ranch's grazing lands and fence lines across its full 9,000 acres, a partnership of equals that surprised no one who had watched them work together through the long, difficult season of their courtship. For Delia had never wanted a husband who would take over her father's legacy from her, the way Cyrus had tried to, and Chester had never wanted a wife who required managing. What they built instead, in the years that followed, was something neither of them had quite dared to hope for in the aftermath of their separate griefs. A true partnership, forged not in convenience or desperation, but in the slow, patient accumulation of trust, tested by fire and flood and the schemes of a dishonest man, and found, in the end, entirely worth the risk of loving again. On the evening of their wedding, as the last guests departed down the long drive beneath a sky gone violet and gold with sunset, Delia Leland Hadley stood with her new husband at the fence line he had mended for her, the same line where he had first turned a runaway horse from certain disaster, and looked out over land that was, at last and entirely, secured and free and truly her own to share. "Do you know," she said, leaning into his shoulder as his arm came around her, "I think that Jackrabbit did us both a great favor, spooking Juniper the way he did." Chester laughed, a warm and easy sound that had grown more frequent in him with every passing week of the summer. "I will admit I have never before felt grateful to a rabbit." "Nor I," Delia said, "but I am grateful nonetheless. If Juniper had not run, you would not have chased her, and I might never have known there was a man mending fences on my father's land who would one day mend a great deal more than fences for me." "You mended just as much for me," Chester said quietly, turning her gently to face him in the fading light. "I had convinced myself solitude was peace, Delia. You showed me the difference between the two, and I do not think I could ever properly thank you for it, except by spending the rest of my life proving I understood the lesson." "Then prove it," Delia said, smiling up at him. "One ordinary evening at a time, for as many years as we are given." "I intend to," Chester said, and kissed her once more beneath the darkening sky, the wildflowers gone to seed all around them, the cattle lowing softly in the distance, and the whole wide gold country of the foothills settling into the quiet, certain peace of a season finally, truly at rest.